This is one of my favorite natural areas in northeast Indiana for sure. It's called Elkhart Bog Nature Preserve. Very unique, located in Elkhart County, up in the northwestern part of northeast Indiana. This is owned by the Indiana DNR Division of Nature Preserves. There's a small portion that's private that we're still working on acquiring. And in total, it's about 330 acres of this property. Much of that is made up by the bog. There is some planted prairie as well. So if you go to Elkhart Bog Nature Preserve, you walk on a trail through the planted prairie and eventually out to this boardwalk that leads you right out into the bog. Bogs are incredible plant communities. They're not super species rich a lot of times because they are acidic and not a lot of species can handle the acidity as well as the wetness that occurs in bogs. But the species that occur there are very conservative, high quality species, and many of them are considered rare species in Indiana. A bog forms, again, as I mentioned earlier, by there's a glacial lake essentially, and a floating mat forms over that glacial lake. So if you were to go out to Elkhart Bog and walk on this vegetation that you're seeing in these photos, which I wouldn't recommend, it's for a couple of reasons. It's extremely treacherous and wouldn't want to fall through that, but it's also very sensitive. So we don't encourage people walking on the bogs. Occasionally they might do a trip that goes out onto the bog a little bit so you can feel the quaking mat. So it's essentially like walking on a waterbed. You're on this mat of vegetation that's formed by sphagnum moss and sedges, and under that sphagnum moss and sedges is water. It is the lake, and this mat has formed over that lake to the point where it can support some trees, mostly tamaracks, some red maples. There's some tamarack shown there. Some of the shrubs that we see are the leatherwood that's really common throughout here. Leather leaf, Canadaphne. That's very common throughout this area, as well as poison sumac. We get pitcher plants, we get round-leaved sundews out here, and a variety of orchids occur in Elkhart Bog as well. Things like rose pogonia and grass pink orchid. Weslyian Nature Preserve. This is about 140 acres in Wabash County that's owned by Acres Land Trust, and a portion of it is dedicated, a state-dedicated nature preserve as well. So this is a site that's located along the bluffs of the Salamone River. It has some pretty impressive waterfalls like the one you can see here, and an interesting array of plant communities as well. We have upland forests that are primarily dry mesic in nature, so oak hickory. There are floodplain forests like the one shown here that have profusions of Virginia bluebells. We have circumneutral seep habitats, so those are areas where skunk cabbage is really common on the hillsides and down in some of the bottoms as well. And there's a very unique plant community called the hanging fen that occurs at Kokiwani Nature Preserve. So this is a situation where you have this limestone cliff where the cliff itself and up at the top of the cliff has enough water flowing over it that it can support wetland plants. And so because of that limestone substrate and the wetness, we get species like grass of Parnassus and Kelms lobelia that occur in this hanging fen habitat. Really unique place. In addition to Lee Nature Preserve, so this is owned by Goshen College, so we also work with universities to protect some of these nature preserves. This is in Noble County, and it makes up about 1,200 acres in total. Not all of that is dedicated as nature preserve, but a portion is. You can see some of the plant communities that occur here are some of the same ones I've talked about. Upland forests, shrub swamps, marshes. But the most interesting part about Mary Lee Nature Preserve are the kettle lakes and the Marl Beach natural community that occurs around those kettle lakes. And so we haven't talked about Marl Beach yet, but a Marl Beach is a community where marl is the substrate. So marl forms in lake basins where there are these certain types of algae that as they die, they fall to the bottom and they're full of calcium. And so they fall to the bottom, they decompose, but the calcium is left. And that calcium builds up over time and forms this grayish colored, pretty impermeable layer of soil that we call marl. And if you ever find some marl, just dig around in it a bit and you'll find shells that show you that that was an ancient lake that covered this area. So sometimes these marl beaches are what you would think of as a beach. They're right on the margin of these glacial lakes. And if the water were to dry down a bit, that marl beach would expand out into that lake basin. But in some cases, those lakes have totally disappeared for one reason or another. And that marl beach has expanded and covered that entire formal glacial lake basin. And that's the case here at Mary Lee Nature Preserve. And so we have this marl beach that has this really unique plant community that includes things like shrubby cinquefoil, which is the yellow flower you can see here, and twig rush, Those are the two dominant species in this Marl Beach community, as well as things like Sphinx Ladies Tresses Orchid and golden seeded sedge, I think it's called, Carex aurea. It's a rare plant here in Indiana. And then I think this is the last natural area I'm going to talk about. This is Metz Fen, which is also known as Buff Lake Fen, and it's located at Pine Knob Park in LaGrange County. So Pine Knob Park is about 270 acres in LaGrange County, and a portion of that is this Buff Lake Fen, or Mike Metz Fen, not the entire 270 acres. But it is a pretty large fen complex that occurs here. So the Pine Knob Park has some upland woods, it has some natural lakes, some swampy habitats, but then the best part of it to me is this Mike Metz Fen and Buff Lake Fen. And I have a little bit of history with this property. So I went out there to do some pre-restoration monitoring. Blue Heron Ministries, which many of you probably know of, was going to be doing some restoration at this Mike Metz Fen. It had been disturbed, there were drainage ditches through it, there were drainage tiles underground, invasive species had become prevalent, and Blue Heron Ministries was able to secure a grant that allowed them to go in and take out those drainage tiles, fill in some of those ditches, re-meander a stream through there, and control invasive species. And so I was hired as a consultant at that time to go out and document the plant communities that occurred in this fen prior to the restoration efforts. And there was a small area of fen that was present at this property at the time that was really nice, but the goal was to expand that fen through this restoration effort. When I was out there, I'll talk about this more in a bit, but I found a plant that was considered extirpated at the time. And Blue Heron Ministries has done a really good job of amplifying that plant out of this property, and I'll talk about it in a bit. So Blue Heron went in and they did all that work, and the first time I really got to go back there during the growing season was this past year, and I was just blown away by how good this place looks. Why these rare plants are rare, very briefly, as I talk about some of the rare plants that occur in northeast Indiana. I'm going to show these maps for each of the species. These are maps from the Biota of North America program, or BONAP. If you're not familiar with those, you can ignore this brownish color. That means the plant is not known at all from that state. The dark green color you can pretty much ignore as well. It means the plant is known from that state and it's native in that state, but it doesn't tell you where in the state it occurs. What I want you to focus on are the lime green. That means the plant is native in that state and it's known in that county, or was at one time. The yellow colors mean it's native in that state, it was known in that county, but it's considered a rare species within that state. And the orange color, you can see in Ohio, there's some orange there, it means that it's native in that state, it was known in those counties, but today it's considered extirpated from that state. It no longer occurs naturally in that state. And the other thing I want to point out are these abbreviations I have up here at the top that you'll see over and over for each species. ST or SE means state threatened or state endangered, so that's our rare status for that plant. S2, that would be the subnational conservation status rank, or in our case, the state conservation status rank. And those range from 1 to 5, with 1 being a critically imperiled plant, 2 being an imperiled plant, 3 being something that we consider vulnerable, 4 being something that we consider apparently secure, and 5 being something that's secure. And those rankings are from NatureServe, which is a spin-off from the Nature Conservancy that tracks these rare species globally. And then the G rank, shown here, G5, T5 in this case, is that global rank. So that shows that that plant is globally critically imperiled if it were G1, or globally secure if it were G5. In a couple of places you'll see that T rank. That means that there's a variety or a subspecies that is also ranked, in this case, secure. So the first one I'm going to talk about is bog rosemary, Andromeda glaucophylla. And we do have a variety of it in Indiana, and that's why it has that T rank. So this is a state-threatened species in Indiana. We consider it imperiled within the state, and globally, though, it's secure. So as you look at its distribution, you can see that Andromeda glaucophylla is right at the edge of its range here in northern Indiana. It's a more northern species that doesn't occur further south, with one possible exception in West Virginia. Who knows if that record is correct? It doesn't occur further south of northern Indiana. And as you look at this map in northern Indiana, I can tell you that it's not known from nearly that many counties today. It has decreased, in part because of its habitats. It grows in bogs and fens, so it's pretty habitat specific as well, but also in part because of climate. So climate warms, we lose some of these northern species. And this is one that I think we're starting to lose a bit. But it still does occur in some of our best bogs and fens. Kittentails, Weslyian, is a state endangered, critically imperiled plant here in Indiana. Globally, this is one that's considered vulnerable. So this is one of the rarest plants that occurs in Indiana. As you can see by its distribution, it's only known from the Midwestern United States. So we consider this a Midwestern endemic, where it occurs primarily in prairies. It occurs in gravel hill prairies, especially in Indiana. Here in Indiana, we see it on bluffs above rivers or above wetlands. As you get into Wisconsin, further west in its range, it occurs just in these dry prairie habitats. But it's a really rare plant here in Indiana. This is it in flower, so it's not the showiest thing when it's in flower. But because it is one of our rarest plants, we have a group of people working on this plant through the Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance, who are working on conservation efforts for this plant, trying to monitor the populations. Wild Calla palustris, is a state endangered, critically imperiled plant in Indiana. This is one that is globally secure, though. So a lot of times you're going to see this state endangered, critically imperiled, globally secure over and over with our plants. We have a number of plants that are right at the edge of the range in northern Indiana, and this is another one of those. But again, this is one that in Indiana we see in very specific habitats. We see this occurring only in our bogs, or very occasionally in boggy woods habitats where there is a depression and they grow in that basin of depression. Cypress knee sedge, Carex decomposita, is a state threatened, state imperiled, globally vulnerable to apparently secure species. So even though it's globally vulnerable to apparently secure, when you look at its distribution in North America, you can see that it's rare in almost all of the states in which it occurs. And it has a pretty spotty distribution overall. So I think this one might be a little bit more imperiled than apparently secure. I think maybe vulnerable would be a better ranking for this. But as you look at its distribution, you see that it's largely within the Mississippi embayment and along the coastal plain of the United States. And these are places where bald cypress is a common plant. So the common name of this one, cypress knee sedge, gives you a sense of where it might grow. It grows on the knees of bald cypress, within that southern portion of the range at least. But then you see we have a couple of occurrences up here, including one in Allen County. And we don't have bald cypress as a native plant in Allen County. So in the northern portion of its range, it tends to grow on buttonbush, at the bases of buttonbush or on hummocks where buttonbush sticks up out of the water. But it's still a really rare plant. So this is one of our plants that's at the edge of its range from the south. Livid sedge, Carex livida. You see again, state endangered, critically imperiled, globally secure. This is a plant that as you get up into Canada becomes much more common. It's still pretty spotty just north of us in Michigan and Wisconsin. In Indiana, we have it at one site in Steuben County in a really high quality fen. So this has very critical habitat, very specific habitat that it grows in here in Indiana. Up as you get further north, it's still a fen species, but it grows in these interdunal fens as well, so it has a little bit broader amplitude as you get further north. In addition to being very narrow habitat that it can grow in, a lot of you might think sedges are difficult to identify. Most of them are pretty easy to find at least. This one is pretty hard to find. You can see it has this grayish green color, but everything is held very erect. It's this very strict, narrow plant. And even though it has that color, even when you're in the right place for it, it can be really hard to find this thing. So it's possible. The green star sedge, Carex stellata, state endangered, critically imperiled in Indiana. Globally, it's considered imperiled or vulnerable. So this is one of our rarest plants that occurs in the state as well. Looking at its distribution, you see it's not only a Midwest endemic, it's endemic to only 3 states within the Midwest: Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan. And that's the only places in the world this sedge occurs. On top of being restricted to these 3 states where it occurs only in fen habitats, this is a plant that was very recently described as new to science. That this plant occurred in 2 places in Indiana, one in Wabash County, one down in Henry County, I believe was the other one. The giant blue cohosh, Caulophyllum giganteum, state endangered, critically imperiled, globally secure to apparently secure. As you can see, this is an edge of range species in Indiana, but it's at the edge of range in 2 different places. So this one is kind of interesting in that it's at the edge of its Appalachian range, where these Appalachian species wrap around into southeast or southern Indiana. Martin County is where this one occurs in southern Indiana, but then it's also at the edge of its range up here in Steuben County, where it's at the east or the west side of the eastern portion of its range, or the northern portion of its range. And so when you just look at Indiana's map and you see this is only known from Steuben and Martin counties, you say, well, how could that possibly be? It's got to be in between somewhere. But when you look at this overall distribution, you see it just wraps around the state and barely gets in 2 different places. Clinton's lily, Clintonia borealis, state endangered, critically imperiled, globally secure species. Much more common further north. And this has what I would consider that very typical boreal relic distribution. And we see that the plant is very common as you go just north of Indiana, and oddly it extends south of Indiana in this narrow band. Well, that narrow band is the Appalachian Mountains. And at the top of those Appalachian Mountains, there's a cooler microclimate. And so this plant likes cold climates. So it occurs north of us in Indiana, and it occurs at high elevations in the Appalachian Mountains. And we see this boreal distribution represented by a number of our rare plants that we can consider these boreal relic species. That are relics of a time when our climate was colder as that glacier was retreating for the last time. So this is also called blue bead lily. These fruit are bright blue in color. These nice yellow flowers. If you crush the leaves, they smell just like cucumbers. So if you ever find this plant up further north, try crushing the leaves and smelling it. We have this in Indiana now in 2 places. One is in Steuben County, the other is in northwest Indiana in Porter County, nowhere else in the state. And it's likely going to blink out over the course of some of our lifetimes as the climate continues to warm and push it out. Another plant with a similar fate, I'm afraid, bunchberry, Cornus canadensis, also very common outside of Indiana, but extremely rare in Indiana. You can see at one time it was known from a number of counties, a handful of counties, at least in the northern part of the state. Today we have this at one site in Steuben County, nowhere else in the state hasn't been able to hang on. It's one of those boreal relic species, likes cooler climates. You can see it's starting to extend down the Appalachians there as well. These are probably populations in the Rocky Mountains, up at high elevations as well. So we have just one place left now in Indiana, unfortunately. Beautiful plant, small, low-growing shrub. Pink lady slipper orchid, Cypripedium acoli, state endangered, critically imperiled, but somehow globally secure plant. And as you look at its distribution, you see it's known from a number of counties throughout the eastern United States. Talking to botanists in the Great Lakes region, though, we're seeing this plant decline. So I'm not so sure how it's doing in the southeastern United States, but up here in the Great Lakes, it's not doing so well. And a large reason for that tends to be, I think, the anthropogenic influences that this one is facing. This is a plant that in its northern range grows only in bog habitats. And many of our bogs have been drained, or water has been added to them to make ponds, or they've been filled in, or they've just undergone succession to the point where they're no longer bogs, they don't have the appropriate habitat, they're now shaded in by trees. So horsetail spike rush, Elaeocris ectosetoides, state endangered, critically imperiled in Indiana, apparently secure within the United States, within the world, I should say, globally. But this is one of those plants that as you look at its distribution, you can see it has a pretty good coastal plain disjunct distribution. So most of its population, the core of its range, are along the coastal plain of the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. There's a bit of a gap in between there, and then it occurs right there in the Great Lakes region. And again, this is a phenomenon we see over and over with these coastal plain disjuncts. We'll see the same distribution, some even more pronounced than others, where there are no occurrences interior until you reach the Great Lakes region. In Indiana, this is a critically imperiled plant, but you can see at one time we had it from a few counties in the northeast part of the state. We've checked almost all of those places and found it only at one site remaining. Glyceria grandis, American mannagrass, a state endangered, critically imperiled plant, globally secure. Another edge of range thing, at the very southern extent of its range here in northern Indiana. This is the plant that occurs at Duff Lake Fen that I found when it was considered extirpated. There was just a small population, and Blue Heron Ministries did a great job of amplifying that, spreading it around that property. And this is how it grows there now, these big populations of it. Really excited to see this plant doing well there. It since has been found in a couple of additional places in northwest Indiana, so we have 3 or 4 populations of it in the state. Still is a state endangered plant, but it seems to be doing better than we once thought it was at least. Pale vetchling, Lathyrus ochroleucus, another one of these really rare plants in Indiana that globally secure, pretty much at the edge of its range, at the southern edge of its range in northern Indiana. But this is one that also, I think, requires a specific disturbance regime. It's a plant that grows in these open, dry mesic woodlands, almost savanna-like habitat, where it's pretty dry, gravelly, sandy soils. but it needs some sort of disturbance to keep those places open. Fire was probably the natural disturbance that maintained those areas. And as we've taken fire away from the landscape, this plant has definitely suffered, to where at one time it was known from a number of counties in the northern part of the state. Today it's only in a couple of places. Though I do think I might have found a new population in Elkhart County last year. I need to go back and check it this June or Indian plant. Green Addersmouth orchid, Malaxis unifolia, another one of these very, very rare things in Indiana, globally secure. But it doesn't really show up at the edge of its range. Maybe it's one of those things that wraps around Indiana and it's at the southern edge of its northern range and the northern edge of its southeastern range. Hard to explain the distribution of this one. It is a very tiny plant. So these get maybe 4 inches tall. There's green flowers. It's in full flower right there. Well, maybe not full flower. These are still in bud up at the top. These things look like broccoli. They're still in bud. But these are in full flower, so that's as showy as it gets. Easy to overlook this one. In the northern part of its range in Indiana, it grows in bogs. It's the only place you're going to find bogs and one wet prairie as well. In the southern part of its range, it's in dry upland forests, but it's growing in moss that stays pretty moist, so there's a little bit of moisture, but again, that acid component is likely what this plant needs. Yeah, this one always gets some oohs and ahs. The orange-fringed orchid, sometimes called yellow-fringed orchid, Platanthera ciliaris, state endangered, critically imperiled, but globally considered apparently secure. Unfortunately, in Indiana, not known from nearly that many counties today. It's definitely declined. It occurs in a wide-ish range of habitats, though. It'll occur in bogs. It'll occur in pin oak flatwoods. It'll also occur in savannas in some cases. Again, that factor that seems to be the limiting factor is the acid soils again. This also has a little bit of that coastal plain disjunct distribution going on. It continues inland further than most of our coastal plain disjuncts, but you see there is that gap, and then it occurs up in the Great Lakes region as well. The eastern prairie white-fringed orchid, Platanthera leucophea. Not only is this one state endangered and state critically imperiled, this is a federally threatened species. And globally it's considered imperiled to vulnerable. So this is another one of our rarest plants. You look at that county distribution, rare in every state in which it occurs, not known from nearly that many counties today. This one has dropped off exponentially, in large part because of anthropogenic disturbances. So this is a plant that in the western portion of its range tends to grow in mesic upland prairies that were largely converted to agriculture as soon as we could do that. And we lost a lot of these plants immediately when that happened. Here in Indiana, it's more of a wet prairie and fen species, especially up in northeast Indiana. It's more of a fen and boggy fen habitat thing. Unfortunately, we have no remaining populations that are extant that we know of in northeast Indiana, though I do think it might be here somewhere. We just haven't relocated those yet. The only extant population is over in northwest Indiana. One population that consists of maybe 8 or so plants as far as we know. This is a plant, though, that doesn't flower every year. This is a plant that doesn't come up out of the ground every year. We monitor that one population, and some years we don't see it at all. Some years it comes up and then just dies back. And if we're lucky, it flowers. It seems to be based on precipitation in the spring. And sometimes it's the spring, it's based on precipitation from the spring the previous year. So it may be next year that's a good year for it. Maybe this year will be good. We're hoping it's a good year. But because it doesn't come up, it doesn't flower every year, and it has a fairly narrow blooming period, I think this one could be overlooked in some of our fens in northeast Indiana, where it once was known to occur, and it's just been overlooked since because we haven't been there at the right time or in the right year. American Schutzarea, not a plant that's going to get the oohs and ahs of the last two. Schutzarea prostris, subspecies Americana. It's in fruit here because the fruit are more exciting to look at than the flowers are. I thought I'd show that instead. It's also called American bladder pod. These little pod-like fruit give it that common name. And identifiable, it looks like a rush or a spike rush vegetatively, but it has this little pore right at the tip of the leaf that can help you identify it when it's not in flower or fruit. State endangered, critically imperiled, globally secure, and the subspecies is globally secure as well. Again, this is one that's at the edge of its range. In northern Indiana, it's more common as we go further north. Here in Indiana, we only see it in bogs. It occurs in boggy fens over in northeast Ohio as well, and in some marshes up as you go further north into Michigan and Wisconsin. But here it's an extremely rare plant. In fact, we had it listed as extirpated until a couple of years ago when we found a new population in Kosciuszko County, which was a new county for it as well. So some of these things definitely have been overlooked. And this is one that could be out there somewhere else. And I hope that it is, and I hope we can relocate additional populations at some point. Outside of our fens. Eastern featherbells, Sthenanthium gramineum, plant that many people aren't familiar with, state threatened, considered critically imperiled though, and globally apparently secure. This one has a really spotty distribution throughout the eastern United States, a lot of counties that it's known from. Even in Indiana, we show a fair number of counties, but it's not known from nearly that many places today. I think it's disturbance regime that it requires is part of the reason for that, but I also think this one might be somewhat inherently rare. And I don't know what it is that drives that rarity. I don't know if it's something going on underground with the microbacteria, or if it's something that's going on with pollinators, but we don't see nearly as much of this plant as we used to. We have a team that's starting to work on this with the Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance to try to track down some of those old populations and potentially do some reintroduction efforts for this plant as well. It tends to grow in dry mesic, very open forest habitats or woods habitats. So oak and hickory type habitats on gravelly or sandy soils. Valeriana uliginosa. This is a plant that's really an attractive spring blooming plant that occurs only in our fens here in Indiana. State endangered, critically imperiled in Indiana, but globally apparently secure. You can see it's at the edge of its range, but also has that very critical habitat in our fens. And lastly, Baxter's violet, Viola baxteri, a state endangered, critically imperiled species in Indiana that to date has not been ranked globally. And that's because it was fairly recently recognized again. It was split out many years ago as a distinct species, but fairly recently it was split out again as a distinct species by Harvey Ballard from Ohio University. Harvey's done a lot of work, his life's work, on the violets of the eastern North America, and considers this a distinct species from the similar Viola petitifida, which is the prairie violet, in large part because you can't see it in this image, but I put on my computer screen, the hairy stem, hairy petioles, or leaf stalks, and the hairs on the leaves of this plant. Also, the seeds are slightly different than they are in the prairie violet. This species occurs in the eastern United States, in the eastern United States, I should say, whereas the prairie violet occurs in the prairie region and barely gets into western Indiana. So this is a plant that, when Harvey Ballard did his work, he found records of this plant occurring in 2 counties in Indiana. One was Wells County, and the other was Jay County within northeast Indiana. And I monitored that Jay County population. We thought that was our only extant population of that in the state. And then a couple of folks in the back of the room here with Freya Bernson and Joanna Steeving started finding this plant in Allen County. And they found several populations that we had no idea. It was never known from Allen County. They found it and documented its populations, and they're actually working on a team now with the Indiana Plant Conservation Alliance. They may not know it yet because they've asked me if they could. I don't think I've gotten back to them yet with our alliance's decision if they could, but they're going to be working on this species to try to conserve its populations and potentially amplify it for some reintroduction efforts as well. So these places that I talked about, these plants that I talked about would not be here today without the incredible hard work of all the organizations shown here in Northeast Indiana and similar organizations that exist throughout the state.